So you have the black pieces and your opponent opens with one d4 and you start getting nervous, you start freaking out, you feel like you never do well against one d4, and that's a problem because if you don't overcome that, that's going to be a big leak in your game. One d4 is becoming much more popular now, especially with openings like the London and the Catalan getting a resurgence. So you need to fix this aspect of your game. I have some thoughts on that for those of us at the amateur level. That's coming up, so stick around. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. A reminder that everyone is welcome to email me with any questions or topic ideas. You can reach me at info@thechessangle.com. There's a link in the show notes. You do not have to be a part of our Patreon or anything like that to submit questions. There's no paywall for anything like that for this podcast. By being a regular listener and enjoying the podcast, as far as I'm concerned, that more than qualifies you to ask a question. And we do like that because if you have a question or a topic suggestion, that means that other people are probably looking for that as well. So there's a good chance that I may use it. I can't promise you that I'll use it on the show, but I will certainly look at everything that comes my way. I'm going to be addressing some mail in next week's episode, but just wanted to throw that out there as a reminder. So let's talk about 1d4. A lot of players, but especially those of you who may be kind of starting out or approaching the intermediate level, 1d4 is often a major problem and people kind of freak out about it. And I have some thoughts about that. One major reason why you may be struggling, it's actually a pretty simple answer, is you simply do not have a solid repertoire against 1d4. You probably try some different things, maybe you wing it, but that's not going to work. When your opponent plays 1d4, you need to know exactly how you're going to handle that. Now, this takes time. This isn't something you're going to knock out on a Saturday morning in an hour. This takes over-the-board experience, analyzing your games, figuring out which opening you want to use. I have some specific thoughts on that I'll talk about in a little bit, but you need a solid repertoire against 1d4. In other words, you need to make a conscious effort to fix this gap in your game. And if you're uncomfortable facing d4, well, guess what? The repertoire you're using either isn't working for you, maybe it doesn't suit your style or your personality, or you're not spending enough time studying that opening. Now, when I had Anthony Levin on the podcast, great guy, he made a fantastic comment, which I love. He goes, before you abandon an opening, you really need to ask yourself, is it really the opening, or is it that you need to learn your opening better? And I think that's true. And many players, they really don't make an effort to have a solid repertoire against 1d4, and then they wonder why it's always a problem. I also think most amateur players, I'll argue, they spend too much time on e4 openings. In other words, when they study their openings as black, they're focused on facing one e4. That tends to monopolize most of their study time with the black pieces. In other words, they're working on variations of the Sicilian or maybe the Carol-Can, maybe the French, all good openings. Now, I don't recommend the Sicilian for beginners and adult improvers. That's just me, but that's a separate rabbit hole I'm not going to go down now. But the point is, most players are spending a lot of their opening study with the black pieces on dealing with one e4, and then facing one d4 becomes sort of this gray, amorphous no man's land that they don't fully address. So the simple answer is that you're not spending enough time studying your openings as black, particularly against one d4. It goes along with another pet peeve of mine. I'm sorry to give you the speech again, but it's the idea that white has the advantage, right? If you have the white pieces, you have an advantage. I can't even begin to tell you how false that is at the amateur level. That's utter nonsense. Now, I know you've heard me say this before, but it bears repeating. White's theoretical advantage from moving first, it's very slight because people think, oh, white has this tremendous advantage. It's this huge advantage because he moves first. Not really. It's a slight theoretical advantage, and that assumes that there's perfect play by both sides. See, the idea is if there's perfect or near perfect play by both players, then yes, moving first maybe has a very slight advantage. But at the amateur level, because it's far from perfect or near perfect play, it's nowhere near it, even for strong amateur players, any possible theoretical advantage is completely shattered because the games are going to be riddled with inaccuracies and mistakes. So, the idea that white has an advantage at the amateur level is utter nonsense. You should play to win regardless of what color you have. I know when you hear titled players speak of their games, they'll talk about how, oh, I had white or I had black. It's sort of this with white, with black. Oh, I drew with black or I won with white. That should not be part of your vocabulary at the amateur level. The color doesn't matter. Just play to win regardless. And the reason I mention this, a lot of amateurs think that they have an advantage because they have the white pieces, because again, that's where they're spending most of their study time. It's not that you have a disadvantage because you have the black pieces. You're simply not studying it enough. And so that translates into, oh, well, I have an advantage with the white pieces. No, you're more comfortable with that because that's probably where you're spending most of your time. So the analogous thing with openings as far as E4 and D4 is that people think that facing one D4 is a lot more tricky, but the truth is they're just not studying that opening as much. They're studying their openings with black against E4 more, and they're not giving their openings against D4 equal treatment. So that's sort of the short answer as far as work ethic. You simply need to spend more time and make a conscious effort cleaning up your openings as black against 1D4. Now, speaking of not spending enough time on your D4 openings, let's talk about productivity and how we can use our time effectively. I want you to ask yourself, how much time are you spending on social media? How often are you mindlessly scrolling on Facebook or Twitter or Instagram or TikTok? Now, I read something not that long ago that the average adult spends about 2 hours a day on social media. Think about that. 2 hours a day. That's 14 hours a week. Think about using that time for chess study and how much better you would get and how much more productive you can be. And just ask yourself, are you really wasting a lot of time on social media and then complaining that, well, I don't have time to study chess? Now, yes, a major theme of this podcast, part of the reason I started it, is really about playing at the club level over the board and really for busy adults who have a conventional job and a life outside of chess and who have limited study time. But you got to put some time in. I mean, I'm not implying throughout this podcast or any of my episodes that you can't study at all. I mean, you have to put some time in. I know it's limited, but if you were to get rid of the social media, at least the amount of time you're spending on it, you'll see a significant improvement in the amount of time you can spend on chess. And so that's something I wonder about. Now, one thing I did, and all the productivity gurus kind of recommend this, I removed social media from my phone completely. I don't have Twitter, I don't have Facebook, nothing's on there. I have Twitter and Facebook's accounts, but I don't have them on my phone because very simply, social media can easily become a toxic time waster. They also did some studies that people who spend a lot of time on social media generally are not as happy as those who don't. And there are experiments on this in the book where they had a control group and an experimental group, and the control group was basically told to use social media as they normally do. The experimental group was told to delete it from their phones and not use it for 2 weeks or no, it was more than that. It was like 6 weeks. I'm paraphrasing, but it was for a period of time. And they found that those who did not use social media were significantly happier at the end of this trial period. So something to think about. I don't want to get all preachy and philosophical, but when you're complaining that you don't have time to study chess, think about how much time you're spending on social media. Like for me, honestly, and I'm not trying to sound sort of elitist or that I'm on my high horse here, but if I spend more than 5 or 6 minutes on any social media platform, I feel guilty. It's like robbing a bank. I just, go in, do what I need to do and get out. I probably shouldn't have used robbing a bank as the analogy, but you get what I'm saying. If I have to go on social media to post something or check something, that's what I do. In other words, I use social media purposefully. I don't go on there to just scroll. If I go on Twitter, it's because I want to post something, probably about an episode. I do that and I leave. Or maybe I want to go on Twitter because I want to check something like that. Or if I go on Facebook, I want to post something for the club. Maybe I want to check something. That's it. 5 minutes in and out. But I know if I have it on my phone, that's probably not going to happen. I'm going to be tempted to do it longer. So I just use it mostly on my desktop. I mean, I do have it on my tablet, which I don't carry around with me all the time, but you get the idea. I don't have it on my phone. Something to think about. And I will tell you now, if you delete social media from your phone, it is very, very freeing. And the other thing too, this is sort of, I'm making a little bit of a right turn here, but this is a little bit of a vent. So incoming vent here. On Twitter, what a lot of people will do is they'll post a position, which is cool. Don't get me wrong. I sometimes look at those myself. They'll say, okay, white to move and win here, or black has a defensive move. What's the right move? But some of these puzzles are actually very, very tricky. And you always get these people who reply with the answer and like, oh, I got it in 2 seconds. That was easy. Okay, no, it wasn't. You totally checked an engine on your phone and it wasn't easy for you. And maybe you just wanted the attention. I'm sorry, I'm calling these people out. I see this on Twitter all the time. It drives me crazy. Somebody posts this really difficult puzzle and then somebody replies, oh, I got it in 5 seconds. That was easy. Okay. Yeah, because you checked Stockfish on your phone. Anyway, it's things like these that you see on social media, but you may want to step back and take a look at your social media use. Okay. I know I sound like a grouchy old fuddy-duddy saying that, but it can really free up time to study chess or anything else that you want to do when you're busy and you're working and you have a family. So something you should be a little introspective about, in my opinion. All right, the next thing about dealing with 1d4, generally speaking, now I'm getting a little philosophical here. D4 openings have a certain strategy to them. In other words, there's a certain depth to them, whereas a lot of E4 openings are more immediate. I feel like a lot of E4 openings are simply about memorization, right? If white does this, black does this, and it's a little more straightforward. D4 openings tend to be a little more positional, a little more nuanced. Now, I'm speaking in very, very general terms. Of course, there are some E4 openings that are positional, and nuanced, just as many D4 openings are tactical. So yeah, you may have heard this like, E4 openings are more about tactics, and, D4 openings are more about, strategy. I mean, yes and no, but I think we can agree that D4 openings tend to be a little more positional and a little more nuanced, whereas E4, like I said, tends to be a little more immediate. That's just kind of my viewpoint. Some people might fight me on that, but because these D4 openings have often a little more depth and a little more nuance to them, they can often be tricky. But again, that goes back to the fact that you're either not spending enough time on them or you don't have a solid repertoire against D4. And this goes back to what I said earlier, that since most people, I believe, are studying their openings as black dealing with E4, that's where they're spending most of their time, they're not learning these basic concepts about D4 openings. And as a result, they're having trouble. Another thing, a lot of E4 openings are based more on memorization. So people are kind of doing rote memorization rather than understanding the ideas. And I think a lot of D4 openings are more about ideas than memorization. And people don't really grasp the ideas. Like they try to learn how to fight against D4 and they just get into memorization, but they're not really understanding the themes. I mean, yes, even when you're fighting against E4, you have to understand the themes of the opening. But what I'm saying is when people study how to play against E4 as black, I feel they're doing just a lot of memorizing. And then they try that same approach when studying how to play against D4. And I don't think it works as well. In other words, as far as the memorization end of it, you can get away with that a little bit more with E4 openings than with D4 openings. And again, this is provocative. This is a little controversial. That's just kind of my take, because I know a lot of people at this level struggle with D4 So I think there's a certain amount of validity to what I'm saying. It's just two very different approaches, E4 and D4, and people really aren't understanding that difference. So now let's talk specifically about how you can play against D4 as far as opening choices. Now, as you know, I use the Nimzo and the Queen's Indian as a complete system against the D4 pawn. And understand it took me a long time to develop that and become comfortable with that. So remember, with everything I'm saying, this all has to be accompanied by lots of over-the-board experience, studying, but also analyzing your games. You have to analyze your games with an engine. It's just so important. So when you play a game against D4 and you really had trouble, you need to really zone in on what was causing your problems. And then once you understand that, you apply that to your next game. And then let's say in your next game, you still have trouble with D4. See what you did wrong. Again, you have to make a conscious effort to fix this. Otherwise, this is just going to be some sort of no man's land in your game that you're always going to have trouble with. And understand, this is very common. A lot of players, when you're up and coming, have trouble against D4. Now, I started out with the Nimzo when I was younger, and the Queens, I kind of dabbled with it, and I had trouble and I dismissed it. And the truth is, I dismissed it prematurely, but then I rediscovered it, and now I really fell in love with it. I mean, I really, really enjoy playing the Nimzo and the Queen's Indian. I do really well. I'm also going to explain in a little bit how you can deal with the London system and the Catalan, because I know that drives players crazy. But let me talk a little bit about the Nimzo and the Queen's Indian defense. So just so you know, this is not a Neil thing. This is a universal thing. A lot of players, even players much stronger than I am, will use the Nimzo Indian and the Queen's Indian as a complete system against 1D4. That is a thing. I do consider them system openings, but think of the Nimzo and the Queen's Indian as sort of a package deal. All right, because there are times where you have to shift to the Queen's Indian or the Nimzo. Like, in other words, you may say, okay, I'm going to play the Queen's Indian. Obviously, it depends on what white does, but you then may need to shift to like a Nimzo structure. There are some subtle differences. I mean, they're kind of similar. A lot of it has to do with where the dark squared bishop goes and how early you fiend Keto. I'll talk about it in a minute, but again, you can use the Nimzo and the Queen's Indian as a complete system against D4. And it just, it works very, very well. But again, this comes with practice and experience, but it's something you may want to look into. I'm not saying that's the only way to play against D4. That's just what I use. I really can't speak about other openings at length because I simply don't use them. This has kept me in good stead for quite some time. Now, if you're interested, I did do a dedicated episode on the Nimzo and Queen's Indian defenses. That's episode 48 of this podcast. I'll put a link for it in the show description, so you may want to check that out. But let's talk now about the Nimzo and Queen's Indian defense, just on a very basic level. I don't want to get into too much theory. So after D4, knight F6, C4, E6, right, opening the diagonal for the dark squared bishop, whether you go into a Queen's or Nimzo depends on what white does here. Now, if he goes knight C3, we're then going to go into the Nimzo. We're going to play bishop B4, pinning the knight. Because remember, with both the Queen's Indian and the Nimzo, we're fighting for that E4 square. We don't want white, to get in E4. We want to control that E4 square. So when black plays knight C3, we need to go bishop B4, pinning the knight so that he doesn't have control over E4. That's the whole point of the Nimzo Indian. But what I love about it too, not only are you fighting for E4, black's development is very smooth. I mean, right away, you have the kingside knight and the bishop developed, black in castle, very, very smooth. And the idea, again, just speaking very broadly, black is going to give up one of his bishops for white's knight. But again, at the amateur level, don't get so caught up in the whole like two bishops thing, because most people know that they have the two bishops, but they don't know what to do with it. So don't even worry about that. But the idea is that you're trading on C3, and what you get is, as black, is smooth development and control over E4. You're preventing white from playing E4. you castle, and then you also get a doubled pawn there. But then the thinking is that white gets the two bishops. That's sort of the idea. So anyway, d4, knight f6, c4, e6. After knight c3, black plays bishop b4. That's the Nimzo. However, if instead of knight c3, he goes knight f3, then we go into a Queen's Indian where we fianchetto the light squared bishop. The reason is, if he goes knight f3 instead of knight c3, we already have control over the e4 square. So we can take our time and then fianchetto the light squared bishop. So let's take that from the beginning. d4, knight f6, c4, e6, knight f3. We then go b6. And we're going to fianchetto. The dark squared bishop then goes on e7, right? We castle. That's a Queen's Indian setup. But notice that both are still based on control over e4. So that's the basic idea. Like I said, I did a whole episode on these openings, so I don't want to get into it now. But I just want to say again, you can use the Nimzo and Queens as a complete system against d4. And if you keep using it and you're consistent, you study your games, you're going to find that you really get comfortable. And you're going to find that a lot of players with the white pieces at this level, they're going to start to get uncomfortable because there are some lines where as black, you plant the knight on e4 and then you bolster it in there with f5. It's very, very hard to budge that knight from e4. I talk about that variation in detail in episode 48, so you can check that out. But I just wanted to mention it because this episode is about how to fight 1d4. And again, I urge you to at least consider, just look into it, experiment with it, trying the Nimzo and the Queen's Indian as a complete system. There are other openings you can look into. I know I said last week in the teaser, I wasn't going to make this whole episode about the Nimzo and Queen's Indian, but, I will say it's definitely something you might want to look into. I mean, it's kind of cool to have basically a pair of openings, which I sort of treat as like one opening. I think of it as a system, and you have the Nimzo version and the Queen's Indian version. It's nice to have that one system as a complete defense against d4. Just something to think about. That's my own bias. I'm in favor of it. You may want to check it out. Now for this final segment, let's talk about how to play against the London system and the Catalan. Because I know when you have the black pieces and you face those two systems, it can be very annoying. People get frustrated. They're not quite sure how to handle it. I'm going to tell you what I do. Use it as a suggestion, whatever. You want to take it, you want to throw it away, whatever you want to do. But just some ideas. So against the London system, right? Because I play the London and I don't always talk about how I play against the London. There's two ways to play against the London that I'm going to give you. I'm going to give you two options. Again, there are plenty of other options out there. This is just how I handle it. So after d4, I do play knight f6. White's going to play bishop f4, right? That's your London. I then do e6. And let's say white goes e3. I do d5. And then he might do something like knight f3. I then follow up with c5 and queen b6. Because that queen b6 move, hitting the b2 pawn, probably one of the most aggressive and effective ways to play against the London. A lot of London players hate that. They hate that queen b6 move. So I will play that. I'll usually do this against lower rated players. I mean, if I'm playing like an expert or a master who plays the London and knows it well, I probably won't go into the queen b6 lines, even though you can. I just like to play more solidly against those players. I'll talk about that in a minute. So basically what I do against the London, the sort of schematic that I go for is basically knight f6, e6, d5, and then boom, c5. And then you follow up with queen b6, and you're hitting that b2 pawn. That's how I play against the London very often. Now, I know what you're going to think. Neil, you just said you use the Queen's Indian and the Nimzo against everything. I do. But I've been around, long enough that once in a blue moon, I'll mix it up this way. The London is a little bit of an exception because I know it so well that that's the one opening where I'll kind of mix it up as black a little bit. But fear not, most of the time against the London system, like what I just described, that e6, d5, c5, queen b6 idea, hitting the b2 pawn, I'll do that maybe 20 to 30% of the time. What I normally play against the London is, wait for it, the Queen's Indian. Works beautifully against the London because you're clamping down on that E4 square, right? Just as you are against a normal Queen's pawn opening, like against D4 and C4. So basically, knight F6, right? B6, E6, bishop B7, bishop E7, castle. Queen's Indian, very, very solid system against the London. Very good structure, works very well. I won't go into specific lines, but this is what I'm talking about with these system openings. All right, so to summarize that, against the London, if you want to do that Queen B6 idea, which is an aggressive way to play against it, you can go E6, D5, right? I'm sorry, you would start with knight F6, then E6, then D5, then C5, Queen B6. That's a variation that I will throw out once in a while. And especially if it's someone at the club who I know kind of hates that variation. That's one of the advantages of playing at, the local club level. You kind of know the nuances and the idiosyncrasies of different players. Other players, I wouldn't play that against. But in sticking with my original premise about playing the same openings and my whole speech about using the Nimzo and the Queen's Indian against anything, you can absolutely, and I do this most of the time, play the Queen's Indian against the London. It's very positional. It's very slow and very strategic. I will say that. So if you're kind of a wild, tactical, attacking player, it's probably not going to appeal to you. But that's how I play. I do have kind of a slow, boring positional style. That's just what I enjoy. But Queen's Indian, very, very solid against the London. Works very, very well. Now let's talk about how to play against the Catalan opening, which might be more annoying than the London for a lot of people. But I don't know. The London and the Catalan are, I guess, equally annoying. People have trouble with it. What makes people fear the Catalan, and let me go back a step. Catalan basically is the idea of white playing like D4 and C4 and then an early G3, right? They fianchetto their king's bishop early, and it causes a lot of problems for players with the black pieces. But here's how I approach it. I normally start out as I would with any Indian defense, right? Like D4, knight F6, C4, E6. The thing is, when white plays, I'm speaking thematically, not necessarily like individual move orders. When white plays that G3 and he's about to play bishop G2, just play D5. Clog up that H1, A8 diagonal. And that's a traditional way to play against the queen's pawn anyway. So you're going to play knight F6, E6, and then D5, kind of like the same way I defend against the London sometimes. And then the thing is, here's the trick. You want to get into a closed Catalan, which means you're going to follow up with C6 at some point. So you have pawns on E6, D5, and then C6. Okay, so you're clogging up that diagonal. You're sort of blunting the light squared bishop. Now that C6 idea, it doesn't necessarily come right away, maybe a few moves later. That C6 idea, it may almost seem like a beginner's move because you're just kind of moving a pawn. It kind of blocks the knight. I mean, normally you don't want to block the C pawn anyway, but it just seems kind of like passive because usually black wants to get in C5 and sometimes you can. But believe it or not, as far as taking like tactics and tricks away from white, that C6 idea, having pawns on C6 and D5, where you block the diagonal because white fianchettos his light squared bishop, that's a closed Catalan idea. Very, very effective. So that's something you may want to look into. And very often you'll fianchetto as well and still play C6. So usually you'll go like B6 and bishop B7 where you're facing white's bishop. Because remember, generally this is a quote unquote rule. Doesn't always have to be this way. If someone fianchettos a bishop, right, the best way to defend it is for you to fianchetto as well. You got to just look out for some tactics because that bishop on B7 is probably undefended, at least right away. So even after you go B6 and then bishop B7, which is kind of a Nimzo queen's idea, right? You're adding control to E4. You can still play C6 even with the bishop on B7. I know that seems almost like a beginner's move, like I said, but it actually works very well because it takes away any nonsense on the diagonal, right? So the short answer is a closed Catalan type of structure, I think is very, very good for black, very solid. And that's how I play against it. And ever since I started doing that, I usually do pretty well against the Catalan. So I have, again, knight f6, e6, d5, and then at some point I'm going to play c6. Now, it really depends. Sometimes I will play c5, but just the idea of the closed Catalan playing c6, again, can be very, very effective. So let me give one example of the Catalan that I did against a strong player. And it's an example of where you have to decide, do you want to go c5 or keep things closed with c6? Now, sometimes I will play c5, which is a thematic push in D pawn openings. Sometimes I'll play c6 and go into the close, which I usually do. It's really position dependent, okay? But I just want to give you kind of an idea how this would be applied in practical play. So in this one game, I was black. White played d4. It was knight f6, c4, e6, g3, right? There's that Catalan. He's going to fiend Keto. And then I played d5. Very important. Little bit of theory there. When he plays g3, right, you played e6, just play d5 right away. You're hitting in the center. You're probably going to play d5 at some point anyway in most queen pawn openings. So that's what I did. He then fiend Ketoed, and then I did b6 to sort of fiend Keto as well. He did c takes d5, e takes d5, knight c3, bishop b7, knight f3, bishop e7. Then he castled, I castled. He did bishop f4, and here I played c5. Now, if those are too many moves, that's okay. But an example, I played c5 here because I'm comfortable in these types of positions. But you can also do what I was talking about before, the closed Catalan, which I will sometimes play as well. I could have actually played c6 here, perfectly fine. And again, it seems strange because you have two pawns blocking your b7 on the diagonal, but it's fine, right? Your b7 bishop is blocked because you have your bishop on b7 and then pawns on c6 and d5, but you're okay. c6 is perfectly fine here. That sort of closed Catalan takes the knight away from b5. It bolsters your center, bolsters that pawn on d5, takes away any tactical nonsense from his light squared bishop. So just look into that. All right, so the structure, again, for the closed Catalan is your knight is on f6, you have pawns on e6 and d5, and then at some point you play c6, right? So you're bolstering your d5 pawn. The closed Catalan. Very, very effective, especially if white is a very aggressive tactical player, takes away a lot of the nonsense. And I just want to wrap this up by saying I'm speaking very broadly in general terms, all right? This is not a lifetime repertoire on how to fight against d4. This is not a 45-minute YouTube video. This is not a book. I'm just giving you some basic, very general ideas. Obviously, you're going to have to play. You're going to have to study. You're going to have to research this. I just wanted to give some ideas on how to fight against d4 as far as practically, as far as opening choices. But I also wanted to give some more philosophical ideas about studying and making sure that you're covering d4 as well and not e4. But the bottom line is this is all going to come through experience and playing, but you do need to make a conscious effort to study how to play against d4 so that you have confidence at the chessboard. Because remember, if your opponent opens with d4 and you're already feeling a little nervous or on edge about that, he already has a huge psychological advantage, and that's not a position that you want to be in. But again, it comes through playing, through practice, and I just wanted to give you some ideas to think about and some reasons why I think for a lot of amateurs this becomes an issue that sort of never gets resolved. So at any rate, I want to thank all of you for listening. Really appreciate it. Again, feel free to email any questions or episode suggestions, info@thechessangle.com. As always, I can't promise that your idea will be used, but I'll certainly read everything that comes my way. And as I said, if it's a question or a topic idea that you have, others probably do as well. So if I feel it fits the vibe of the show, I will certainly address it. So we appreciate that. And as always, I hope you win your next game. Have a great day, everybody.